When you're deploying an MVC4 application, the issues are not really that different than deploying an ASP.NET application. So if you're already familiar with deploying ASP.NET Web Forms applications, then deploying MVC is really no different than that. The same issues apply. But it's good to go over them, especially since some of you may have never deployed an ASP.NET application before, and so here are some of the things that you're going to need to keep your eyes open for. One of the things is that you need to have the .NET Framework 4.5 installed on the target web server. This usually means that you're probably going to be using IIS as your web server, although not necessarily, but in all likelihood that's probably going to be the case. And you want to make sure that the .NET Framework 4.5 is available. Now, you don't have to have MVC4 installed on the target server. That is not necessary. You can actually take those DLLs with you when you deploy. So you don't need to install MVC4 out there, but you do have to have the latest version of the framework out there, which right now is 4.5. So what are your options? Well, one of your options is Xcopy, and this is sort of a catch-all term for copying all the files over. It's sort of a way we make it sound fancier. Xcopy was a program, it's been around a long time, that basically does a raw copy of files from one place to another place. And that's still an option for you, whether you use Xcopy or anything that you might use to copy files. That's still an option as long as you are building your project, carrying over your bin and the DLLs and everything you need, then copying all your files over will still work. It's usually not ideal though, because normally what we want to do is compile all of our code into a very small set of DLLs and just copy those along with the content that's needed. So Xcopy still works just fine, but it's not always our ideal scenario. A better scenario is using the publish options that come straight from Visual Studio, because this will give us a lot of flexibility in terms of our target and what we send over and what we don't, as well as giving us some options for Windows Azure that can streamline that process a little bit. You can also do your deployment straight through the Windows Azure API as well, but using Visual Studio's publish option can help us out a little bit there. We also want to make sure we include the necessary DLLs, especially if you're copying to a server that might not have MVC4 installed. We want to make sure that the DLLs that our MVC application depend on go with it. And this is a mistake people make sometimes when they're deploying their first MVC application, is they just copy over the actual application DLLs and the content, and lo and behold, it doesn't work. And that's usually because they haven't also copied over the handful of specific MVC DLLs that are required to make it run, and the server just doesn't have MVC installed. But thankfully, if you're using the publish option, as well as some other options that are integrated with the Visual Studio, that process becomes more or less automatic. So I highly recommend, if you deploy your MVC applications, to take a good long look at using the built-in publishing functionality in Visual Studio. We're going to take a look at the way Visual Studio can be used in deployment. What I have over here is a project called Deployment Test. It's an MVC4 project. In fact, it is the MVC4 project. When I come to File and go to Add New Project, and I pick MVC4 application and I pick the Internet template, this is the project that it gives me, and we're all pretty familiar with it if you've ever used MVC's default stuff before. So here I have it. Doesn't really matter because we're just going to be demonstrating deployment. So one of the things I want to point out is that copying these files still works. So, assuming that I've got everything configured correctly, right, I can actually take these files off my local machine and copy them somewhere using Xcopy or just any sort of file copying mechanism, and even FTP, and it should work fine. The only drawback is I'm probably copying over a lot more than what I need in order for the application to work. So it's not ideal, but it can work just so long as the server that I copied to has .NET Framework 4.5 installed, then a simple copy of the file should work just fine, just the same as it would for web forms. However, we get a lot more flexibility and a lot more power when we use the publish options that are available to us in Visual Studio. And there's a few different ways to get there, but what you can do is right-click on your MVC project and choose Publish. Now, one of the things that I think is cool about this is right off the bat, it asks me, do I want to publish to Windows Azure? And I can either sign up for a free account, which I will not do, or I can download my publishing profile from an existing account. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to deploy anything to Windows Azure before, but it's kind of an involved process sometimes. You have to open up the management console over the web. You have to navigate to the right place. You have to make sure your files are packaged. You have to upload the package and the metadata and specify those. And then you sort of watch this magic happen for a while when as it shuts down your old deployment, puts up your new deployment, and brings it online. It's kind of a time-consuming process, really. And once you've done it a few times, it's not that bad in terms of complexity, but it's still time-consuming. There's a lot you have to do. I'm not saying it still doesn't take a while, but it's really nice to be able to do this just by right-clicking from Visual Studio. So if I have an Azure tenant, I can download the publishing profile from it, and then my Visual Studio can just use that publishing profile. And I can just right-click on my project, hit Publish, and it'll just send it to Azure, package it up, send it to Azure without me having to do anything else, which is really nice. Also has a link for other hosting options, but here's where the magic happens. All of our settings for publishing get stored in a publish profile, even if it's relatively incidental. You can import profiles from other machines. If you have profiles, you can remove them or rename them or whatnot. But what you do is you select from a drop-down list. Now in this case, this project does not have a publishing profile, so I'm going to pick one. I'm going to call this local file system because that's ultimately where I'm going to put this. But of course you want to name your profiles things that reflect what they are. Things where you look at the profile name and go, oh yeah, I know where this is going. So you might have like a debug publish and a release publish, and you might have a publish for different targets. So next thing I get to specify is my method. Web deploy works pretty well for IIS. Basically what it does is it tries to set up a deployment mechanism. It works for Azure. It also works reasonably well for IIS, where instead of doing the FTP, I can set up the server name, the site name, the username, password, the destination URL, and it will actually interact with the server using a specific protocol for deployment that is a little more secure than FTP and works a little bit better. So if you're going straight to IIS that you have some degree of control over, or you know it supports web deploy or web deploy packages, you know, if you've got things all packaged up, you can point to a zip file and point to the site and it'll take care of it. That's something you have to work out with your host. You know, not every server is set up to deal with that, but those can be nice options, save you a little bit of time. Probably the most common one that people end up using is FTP. So I've got a remote host somewhere out there, so I give it my FTP server address, the path to my specific site, which is usually www.root, the username and password for my FTP account, destination URL. This is information that my host can provide me. If you don't have somewhere to host, once again, you can always visit Microsoft's web hosting gallery, and I'm going to go there for a minute just because, as you can see, Azure is large and in charge on this page, but when I go to the hosting gallery, it will actually give me search criteria that I can use to find a host that's appropriate for my project, which is a pretty handy tool if I don't already have an idea of where I want that to go. So what I can do is I can come down here, for example, and pick, you know, how much storage I'm going to need, how many databases I'm going to need, the number of accounts, and it will fine-tune my search results to help me find a package and a host that'll work well for my needs. So FTP is probably going to be a common way that you will connect with those hosts and deploy your application. FPSC is kind of nice if your location supports it. This is basically you give it a remote URL and it deploys that way without any extra fuss. So, you know, if you've already got a secure environment where you can deploy files this way, that's great. Once again, I think FTP is probably going to be pretty common. File system is nice for testing your deployments locally, but it's also nice if you're deploying to a folder that's on your network instead of going through all the hustle and bustle of trying to FTP somewhere. If your server is actually serving up a folder that's on your network, you can use file system as well, and it works great. So I'm going to pick a folder that I've made specifically for this purpose, the deploy test folder. And then I pick the configuration. When I'm setting up a build, the two default configurations are debug and release. Debug will build your project, and it'll have all the debugger files there so you can step through the code and all that good stuff. And it will also use the settings in your web.config.debug. Well, the release mode is what we usually use for deployments. It compiles without all the debugging symbols, and so it runs faster, it's more performant, the files are smaller, and it will use the settings from your web.config.release, which is pretty common. Usually for debugging you have local settings, and for release you have your remote settings. So you want to pick your configuration. You can use Visual Studio to add more configurations too. That's over in your build menu. Different story than deployment, but if you have different kinds of builds you can pick them here. You also have a few different options, like do you want to delete all existing files before you publish? Very common option. I highly recommend it if you can get away with it. Just, you know, blow everything away and do a clean deployment. If you can't do that, then you might look at why you can't do that, because that could be some red flags about your deployment process. Pre-compiling. This is not something that's as big a deal for MVC applications. It's more of a deal for ASP.NET web forms. Usually the first person to hit the website does a compile, so it takes a little bit longer for them. This enables you to do that during publishing to try to avoid that. And you can also exclude files from app data, which is pretty handy if you've been using app data to store local models or local databases or something for your MVC application. You don't want to deploy those. You know, your remote application is probably using SQL Server or something like that, or its own copy of the database, so you don't want to overwrite it or anything. So you might exclude files from the app data folder. In fact, usually we exclude files from the app data folder. So you can set whatever options are pertinent to you. You hit next, and notice database preview is not supported for this publish method, but it is for some. It tells me where it's going. I hit publish. It does a release build. You can see it publish, and it was successful. So that happened pretty fast. If I take a look in this folder, okay, you can see that my content is all here. Here's all my views. Here's my scripts, my images, and anything that's in my content folder, but everything else has been compiled to DLLs. All the packages that I depend on and my application itself has been built into DLLs. I don't have any controllers or anything like that. All those things have been compiled, and so it has only deployed exactly the files that I need. And so that's why using Publish along with the Azure integration is such a great option for deployment.